So Mitterrand and the Parti Socialiste had a very convincing electoral victory in the two elections of 1981. So after the Legislative Assembly elections in June 1981, Mitterrand appointed a socialist, Pierre Mauroy, as Prime Minister of France. And Mauroy had been a kind of long-standing social activist from the tradition of the labor, hard-working labourer who had worked his way up through French politics. What was also noticeable about the new government was that it included the Communist Party. So 4 of the new ministers of the Mitterrand government were members of the Communist Party. And bear in mind, this is at the same time in which Ronald Reagan has become president of the United States, very much campaigning on an anti-communist message. And a lot of people in the United States were surprised that the French Communist Party were so well represented in the French government, and it seems to suggest there could be considerable diplomatic difficulties between France and the United States. But actually, in fact, under Mitterrand, France and the United States probably had a closer relationship than at any time during the history of the Fifth Republic. Mitterrand was very, very adamant that he supported the United States in terms of its efforts to force the Soviet Union to remove its influence in Europe, and kind of built a pretty good working relationship with Ronald Reagan, despite all the concerns that his support of the Socialist Party or his working with the Socialist Party would somehow compromise him. But Mitterrand was very adamant that France is not a communist country and it did not have any kind of political alliance with the Soviet Union. Of course, the French state, the Parti Socialiste was not so much interested in foreign policy reform as it was in domestic reform, and in particular in what we sometimes call redistributing the wealth, in taking using financial and government reform to improve the position of the ordinary person in French society. So we see some interesting changes introduced. The minimum wage in France is raised by 10%. Almost immediately. We see generous government welfare programs being established, or at least being augmented. For example, the state pension that all French citizens are entitled to when they retire, it increased by 64% for a married couple between 1981 and 96, and 74% for someone, a single pensioner. So very, very generous kind of financial support indeed. The working week was officially reduced to 39 hours a week, although not quite the 35 hours that had been promised in the campaign manifesto of 1981. French vacation time became guaranteed, so the amount of time that French workers were guaranteed paid vacation became 5 weeks. Again, very, very generous. The death penalty, as had been promised, was finally abolished. I have the symbol of the guillotine here because I think I mentioned this in an earlier class, but the French state went on using the guillotine until 1977, and it was still technically on the books even at the beginning of Mitterrand's presidency, but he abolished the death penalty, and no more use of the guillotine, and France hasn't executed anyone since. The French state was also committed, under Mitterrand, was also committed to improving the position of women. Under Giscard d'Estaing, there had been a women's secretariat, a women's kind of office established by the government. It never really did all that much. It kind of lost, it had some initial encouragement from feminists, but they kind of lost support when they realised, or at least they came to feel, it was kind of an empty gesture. But under Mitterrand, there was a greater commitment to trying to establish women as full equal of men in French society. So firstly, a ministry for women's rights was established by Mitterrand. Several women served as government ministers under Mitterrand, and various legislation was introduced. For example, in 1985 it became mandatory for married women to sign tax returns alongside their husband. Women also and men also assumed one another's debt in a marriage, and women were given full legal rights over their children and common property alongside their husbands. So the kind of traditional French laws, which kind of favoured men in many of domestic issues in terms of ownership and control over domestic assets, was corrected. The French state, or Mitterrand, also helped or really took steps to try and encourage a greater awareness of French culture as well. In fact, the Ministry for Culture had been established by Charles de Gaulle in 1959, but under Mitterrand, its budget was doubled. Because traditionally the Ministry for Culture, it tended to support opera houses, art museums, and kind of more what we might narrowly define as high culture, but with an expanded budget, the Ministry for Culture under Mitterrand's government became much more kind of ambitious and supported a wide range of cultural initiatives that were not part of the kind of traditional high culture set. One of the most successful, so Jacques Lang was the French Minister for Culture under Mitterrand. One of the most successful innovations he developed was the Fête de la Musique, the Festival of Music. It was supposed to be a one-off event, but eventually became an annual event every June in France, in which large open-air musical events are held free of charge for the public. So that was one of the positive kind of cultural legacies for Mitterrand's government. He was also famous for his grands projets, his grand projects, a variety of elaborate building, French public building and construction that took place primarily in Paris, not exclusively in Paris. But let's see if you guys recognize some of these buildings. So this one here, this Paris Museum, the most visited in the world in 2019, received a significant upgrade in the 1980s. And the answer was the Louvre. What was the upgrade? Essentially, that giant glass pyramid was this kind of new innovation that was placed at the Louvre in in the mid 1980s. It actually attracted a great deal of controversy at the time. I mean, today it's kind of seen as the symbol of the Louvre itself, but at the time it was quite controversial. A lot of people felt it was a kind of classless, modernist streak, kind of defacing one of the most famous historic buildings in the world. So it initially was not very popular, but now it's been generally accepted by the French public as a symbol of France itself. There was also a new opera house built in Paris. A new national library was built, which actually today is named after Mitterrand. And then we have this building here, which was a joint work between the French government and the Arab League. So the Arab World Institute, which is housed in Paris. So this was a 180,000 square feet. I mean, you can see the outside of an impressive looking building. It actually won some important agricultural awards, including, see if you guys can get this, another Jeopardy question. So this title, meaning Elder Brother King, it was held by the imam of the Nizari Shia Muslims. And the answer is, what is Aga Khan? So the Arab World Institute won the Aga Khan Prize for Architecture in 1989. Okay, so the French government was hoping, and in fact it said, that these measures were going to kickstart the French economy. They were putting more money in people's pockets. People could spend more money, and therefore that would lead to an economic boom. The problem was, in the early 1980s, the world was in something of an economic recession. And what essentially the French state was doing was pumping more money into the economy, but without really any kind of matching growth in terms of economic productivity. What does that combination of factors lead to? Well, our old friend, inflation. So inflation was still a problem that was dogging France and began to worsen under Mitterrand in the early 1980s, because essentially there is more money in circulation in France, but it's not as the basis of any kind of increased productivity. And this led to an important development in Mitterrand's presidency, what we sometimes call the U-turn of 1983. That is, the French state undergoes a significant U-turn. The basic problem for Mitterrand's government was that if it really wanted to introduce kind of a more socialist system in which it could kind of try and produce the reforms it was encouraged to do, it would require it to spend money in a way that was against the rules established by the European monetary system in 1979. So essentially, because of France's membership in the European Economic Community, it lost some of its independence in terms of setting it entirely on its own, its economic policy. And what that meant was, if Mitterrand wanted to try and use traditional left-leaning policies, spending more government money, increasing government programs to try and offset the economic recession, that would probably mean that France would have to leave the European Economic Community, would probably break up the EEC in and of itself. So instead, this socialist government decides to go for a full policy of austerity. That is, cutbacks on government spending, trying to tighten down on inflation, and that's what they begin doing. And also, as a kind of symbol of this, Marat is replaced as Prime Minister by Laurent Fabius, who was a more technocratic economist kind of Prime Minister, and so not from the traditional socialist, hard-working kind of labourer tradition that Marat had been from. This is more a well-educated, middle-class political moderate. who in some ways you might compare his economic policies to those of Giscard d'Estaing in terms of a centrist, trying to curtail economic spending on the part of the French government. So the U-turn of 1983 that France's promises of socialism, once they run up against the reality of not necessarily the reality of the French economy, but the reality of France's membership of the European Economic Community, and that kind of hinders its ability to totally kind of introduce its own economic policies. The government decides to try and reform French society within the broader sphere of capitalism, as opposed to dramatically undermining capitalism itself. This also meant these measures impressed a lot of French conservatives, especially those who realised that the Pompidou and Giscard d'Estaing government had not done much to tackle inflation. It's only under the Mitterrand government that French public spending is cut back significantly enough that it helps inflation ease. But it also, at the same time, alienates a lot of French socialists who felt that they were kind of promised one thing in 1981 and Mitterrand has not delivered. Once Mitterrand had decided to make the U-turn, he also fully focused his commitment on embracing the European Economic Community. With his support, the European Single Act was passed in 1985, which basically set in motion the process that led to the establishment of the full European Union in 1992. So in other words, they signed a treaty in 1985, preparing the way for the European Union itself. And what does that essentially mean? It's not just that there would be free trade between the various countries of the European Union, but there would be free movement of goods and people across borders as well. So a dramatic kind of change for France, and especially the kind of old Gaullist tradition of maintaining France's territorial and sovereign integrity, that Mitterrand instead pushes France more towards a leading role in this ever-growing bond amongst the European countries. This was also bad news for the French Communist Party. The French Communist Party, not surprising because of the measures of the Mitterrand government, left the government in 1984 and felt that the government had betrayed the traditional values of both the Socialist and the Communist Party. But their problem was two things. One, now that France was in the European Economic Community, it really couldn't overthrow its own capitalist system because of its interlocking kind of agreements with other European countries, as communists had long called for. Secondly, with the continued decline of large manufacturing industries in France, the traditional working class base of the Communist Party began to decline as well. So even though the Communist Party left the government in 1984, hoping to kind of renew its own electoral fortunes, it essentially was the beginning of the end for the French Communist Party, or at least as at times the largest political party in France. After 1988, the Communist Party never reached more than 10% of the national vote again. And initially, this was seen as good news for the Parti Socialiste, that they would kind of hoover up all the leftover communist voters. But their own problem became is that now that their own policies were kind of more politically and economically centrist, they weren't all that different from what people like Giscard d'Estaing and even Chirac to an extent were proposing. And so it kind of, over time, began to lose its own identity as being a distinct party from representing the French political left, because voters sometimes had a hard time telling its policies apart from those of the kind of Gaullist parties. And furthermore, another issue for the Parti Socialiste was that just as the barons had come to dominate the Gaullist movement in the 1970s, a kind of political establishment that first and foremost served its own interests, this Parti Socialiste in the 80s was beginning to look a lot like that as well. That it was kind of being dominated at the top by old veterans of the party, who seemed more concerned about safeguarding their own political positions, their own personal futures, than for thinking creatively about how to improve French society going forward. So the Communist Party declines, the Parti Socialiste thinks that's a victory for it, and in the short term it is, but the party itself is faced with kind of longer term issues in defining itself as a distinct force with a clear vision for France.